Okay. Good morning or afternoon. My name is Thomas Child, and today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about psychedelic neuroscience from chemistry to consciousness. Just to get a few things started, who am I? Why are you seeing me? You're probably either in the Neuroscience Club, a Plants, Health, and Spirituality, or I've repurposed this video later and you're finding it elsewhere. But to make a very long story short, I was born and raised in Africa. I discovered psychedelics towards the end of high school, and that convinced me to shift from a path of electrical engineering onto a path of neuroscience and chemistry. I'm also the incoming president for Students for Sensible Drug Policy at UF. So, what is Students for Sensible Drug Policy? We're a club. It's also a national organization dedicated to drug policy reform and harm reduction. Basically, we're here to end the war on drugs and see it out the door. What does our club at UF do? We catalyze research, which means we help network undergrads, graduate students, and research labs to engage in psychedelic research with the goal of turning UF into a premier psychedelic research school in the Southeast within the next 5 or 10 years. We build community on campus. So we host regular GBMs, we have a lot of guest speakers, we have a lot of student presenters. We also have some more casual forums like lunches and journal clubs, if that's more your speed. And we also engage the culture. So the psychedelic world is very interesting because there are a lot of small communities and that are very easy to engage with based off of YouTube numbers and subscriber counts and this sort of thing. I'd estimate there's maybe 15 to 30,000 people who are following the psychedelic revolution closely, which means it is very, very, very easy to just reach out and touch whatever community you want. So recently I've been speaking a lot to some psychonaut groups and some veteran groups, but I encourage you to do your own research and find weird little communities on the internet. So where are we going tonight? We're going to cover the chemical and biological classifications of psychedelics. We're going to do some basic neuroscience and discuss the wave computation basis of consciousness, which doesn't mean much now, but hopefully a little later. We're going to talk about how psychedelics specifically affect neurons and the brain in general. We're going to talk about how that can lead to changes in sensory processing and the phenomena of trips and the psychedelic experience in like a more rigorous and kind of like chemical to consciousness way. We're going to cover some of the narrative content of trips and therapeutic outcomes, and then we're going to have a brief discussion over stability chaos setting. So, starting with some really basic neuroscience and some pharmacology, let's talk about like what drugs are and like what they actually do. In your brain, you've got cells, and the cells have like membranes around them. On the surface of the cells are proteins, and some of these proteins are receptors, and a kind of easy way to think about a receptor is like the squishy lock, and a drug is a custom key. And squishy locks are interesting because you can squish them different ways to produce different results. But that's just a really basic overview of pharmacology. Drugs are key, receptors are lock. The drug in itself doesn't have any special properties, but when it activates that lock, it'll cause biological changes, which will have impacts down the line. And very common examples of chemical keys would be dopamine, estrogen, or adenosine. So classical psychedelics are artificial keys to the serotonin 5-HT2A lock. Serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, if you know a bit about psychedelic neuroscience, you're probably already familiar with it. Pretty interesting receptor. It reliably produces similar psychological and biological effects when activated. And the most kind of stereotypical 5-HT2A agonists are LSD-25, which is in the class of ergolines. You can tell because it has this 6+5, because it's got like 3 6-membered rings and 5-membered ring structure. You've got psilocybin, which is a tryptamine. This is the closest structurally to serotonin. And you've got mescaline, which is the prototypical phenethylamine. Phenethylamines are structurally similar to dopamine, and based on like their substituent groups, they can be have a whole range of biological activity. It's also a little more complicated than this. It's chemistry. You can kind of just keep on changing it. There's an endless variation of structures there's an endless variation you can make to the structures of these molecules that can produce different effects. These are some really interesting examples of combined structures produced at different labs that have psychedelic effects. And there are also some drugs that target the 5-HT2A receptor that don't have psychedelic effects. So remember when I was saying about squishy locks being able to be squished in different ways and have different effects? The same receptor that causes a lot of psychedelic action, if you squish it in a different way, can be really, really good for anti-inflammatory effects. And there's more interesting research as well with like multimodal drugs, such as ibogaine. So for the sake of this conversation, we're going to delineate between psychedelics and hallucinogens. Hallucinogens is like a broad category of drugs, and psychedelics is a smaller category of drugs within that. We're going to define psychedelics as serotonin type agonists that produce a certain type of drug experience, generally powerful visionary drug experiences. But it's important to note that like there are many ways to have like visions on drugs. So we need to be a little bit more careful with our language. So for the sake of this conversation, there are some drugs here that people might consider psychedelics, certainly vision inducing, that we're not going to call psychedelic for the case of this conversation because they don't activate the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. Of this list, salvinorin A is probably the most interesting one. It is a kappa opioid agonist that is profoundly visionary and a very interesting drug, but not the topic of tonight. To make things worse, still, even like within this category of psychedelic drug, it gets weirder because the range of like psychedelic experiences you can have from serotonin 5-HT2 agonists is wildly broad. So for example, we have dimethyltryptamine over here with kind of like an artistic recreation of the visual experience of taking DMT. And then you have 5-MeO-DMT over here, which very similar drug if you look at their chemical structures. Kind of similar pharmacology too in terms of where they bind to in the brain, but very, 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 very different experiences of taking them. And so the easy question is the chemical difference. The hard question comes when you go from a tiny chemical and you blow it up to the entire brain and asks, what is like the causal chain between the tiny different structure in the molecule and the wildly different experience happening in the brain? This leads us pretty neatly into chapter 2, which is neuroscience and the wave computing foundation of consciousness. I think that it's a damn shame the extent to which a lot of neuroscientists stray away from discussing consciousness, because I don't think it's necessarily that hard. So understanding how drugs affect the way we see things and the way we perceive things needs to we have to already understand sort of how perception works. And I don't think it's a bad place in this conversation to start from physics because we can kind of easily say that, oh, your brain is physical, it follows the rules of physics. There will be commonalities between, say, the laws that govern the electromagnetic waves and the electromagnetic events occurring in your brain. And here we go, next slide. Waves are fundamental to consciousness. I was mentioning electromagnetism earlier, but waves are fundamental to everything. Just leave consciousness to the side for a second. You've got an atom over here that has a certain shape, and the shape of that atom is governed by the way that like standing waves form around it. If you're not familiar with standing waves, it's kind of like, that's a little too deep. You also have like black holes, which can like spin around each other and cause waves to ripple through like the fabric of gravity. And then you have magnets themselves, which kind of like produce these wave-like structures in electromagnetism. Light, of course, famously is a wave, but I think that the focus of light as a wave is kind of like constraining it too much. It's more like everything is a wave and light happens to be a part of everything. So now that like super basic physics is done, let's do a little bit of neuroscience. If you're not familiar with the neuron, this is roughly how they look. This is a little closer to how they look in reality, but that's just a graphical render. Um, you've got your dendrites over here. They're the primary receiving area for the axon, for the neuron. Generally think of the dendrites as like, okay, this is where we're going to be picking up messages from other cells, and a whole bunch of cells will all be sending a message to a single cell. That single cell will integrate the information in the cell body, kind of like take it all and put it all together. And then it'll send that signal through the axon down into the presynaptic terminal. And then this area will release drugs, neurotransmitters. And that's how signals travel between different neurons in the brain. It's a little more complicated than that. There are some really interesting dynamics in terms of like electromagnetic potentials and whatever, but that's a little too deep. So when things are like traveling down these axons, this is the easiest way of like kind of putting waves into the brain and getting a bit of an intuitive understanding of how it works. When a signal's getting carried down, essentially what happens is you've got like these little channels in the edge of in the wall of the cell. And there's like an electric charge gradient. So there's like a bunch of electric pressure pushing down on those channels. And they'll open just a bit so that the pressure just kind of like whoops out of the cell. This is known as a voltage potential or a capacitor if you've taken like physics 102. But the way that the signals propagate down the cells is in like this wave. You'll get like a little bit coming and it just goes down the cell. When it reaches the end of the axon, it'll link at the synapse. And when that electromagnetic wave arrives at the synapse, it'll cause some chemicals to be released. The chemicals that cross the synapse greatly alter the content of the signals being sent between the neurons, but their activity is still wave-like. So you've got a bunch, and what do I mean by wave-like, right? If you haven't taken chemistry, this might be a little difficult, but you have like these thermal distributions of things, right? So you'll have, oh God. By thermal, I mean that they're governed by like a probability distribution. It's kind of like a bell curve, not really. It's more like this graph down here. And drug intensity across time is actually like a perfect example of like this wave-like action of chemicals across the synapse, because drugs are chemicals across the synapse. They're just ones that aren't naturally there. And if you look at this graph, it's actually the intensity of subjective effects of DMT versus placebo. Placebo is at baseline, and you've got a nice big, really typical peak and then like a slow come down. That peak and a slow come down is not like a trivial structure. That peak and slow come down is a result of the statistical and physical laws that are governing the way that chemicals enter and leave a synapse. And that applies to regular drugs as well. But regular drugs don't give you visions. So just to slam this point home, brains are electric wave computers. You've got like a bunch of different neurons. They're all sending wave signals down to each other through chemicals. Those chemical waves are being converted into electrical waves. Those electrical waves are being converted back into chemical waves, but it's waves all the way through. It's not digital. It's not just like on or off. It is this wave gradient. And fundamentally, our mind is embedded in the structure of this neuronal network. Our moment-to-moment experience, I believe you can make a pretty good case that consciousness itself is the shifting electromagnetic field across all of the neurons in the brain. And the reason I say this is because significant alterations to the structure of the network will lead to alterations in the moment-to-moment processing, and the way that those waves interact, and it'll lead to a change in experience too. This isn't the first time people have linked psychedelics and waves in biology before. In fact, Kary Mullis, who famously invented the PCR, which is a polymerase chain reaction. It's a technique for replicating DNA at a really large scale using like waves of heat. He had that realization while he was surfing on waves on LSD. This is a point where I'd pause for questions, but this is pre-recorded, so I'm really sorry I can't do that. If you would like to know anything about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to me at tchild@ufl.edu. So, more evidence for like wave-based computing, like that's right in front of you, that you can see that's in your experience. You've got two dots and boxes here, and one's perfectly in the middle, and the other is very obviously not in the middle. But you can't really tell like how not in the middle it's by. All you can really say about it is that it's not in the middle. It might be a little down, it might be a little to the left, but you can't be precise about it. You can't put like an exact number on it. Your brain doesn't work like a Cartesian plane. You don't have decimal points of accuracy on grids. What you do have is waves. And I would posit that the way you can tell it's in the center or not is because the waves of your perception and the waves of your visual cortex will interact with each other, will very specifically come into harmony and resonate if it's at the center. I'm kind of trying to recreate this in this box here. Yeah. Why does this have explanatory power? Well, because it links a phenomenon consciousness to something that we can computationally define and empirically validate in terms of brain dynamics. So screw David Chalmers, the hard problem of consciousness can go jump off a bridge. We have it here. It's not that difficult. The real hard problem of hard consciousness is filling out the details, not understanding where subjective experience comes from. Another example of like this interconversion between waves and space and experience is echolocation. Think of bats and dolphins and all these sorts of things. They don't really use their eyes that much. A bat's like in the dark, famously can't see, so it squeaks. And squeaking is sound. Squeaking is like waves moving in the air. But it can make all these squeaks, make all these waves fly out through the air in front of it. And the way that the waves fly back will be processed in the brain and let the bat know what's going on around it. So the bat is using waves of air that is coming back and hitting its brain, turning into brain waves. And then these brain waves are creating a sense of structure and a sense of environment around the bat. If you've ever done signal processing, if you've ever done analytical chemistry or any pursuit like that, you'd hopefully know what a Fourier transform is. We're kind of doing something a little similar in terms of our ability to interconvene between waves and spatial dimensions. So, in summary of this section, waves are the fundamental basis of consciousness in neuroscience. They're fundamental to physics, and we have to play by the rules of physics because we exist in the world. And the brain is a physically governed source of experience. It's a wave computer because we have neurons, and everything that neurons do, everything that biology does, it does in waves, whether it's electromagnetic waves traveling across the surface of the cell, whether it's a statistical wave, chemicals propagating through a medium, it's all wave-like. Moreover, a lot of our perceptions are based in waves. Our sense of light is a wave, and we can see. Sound's a wave, and we can see. And I would argue that space is a result of wave computations that produce it, but a little out of the realm for now. We can conclude that consciousness is a complex and evolving wave system that is fundamentally based in the brain. Okay. So now that we've built those foundations, how do psychedelics enter the picture? as we've hopefully established, your experience and the structure of your experience is based on the neurons and the signals that they communicate. Um, and the way that they're structured is fundamental to the way that they send the signals. If you, what's like a good way of explaining this? Uh, it's not a perfect analogy, but like say you're playing guitar. If you hold the guitar in a certain way, it's going to make a certain sound. If you hold it in a different way, it's going to make a different sound. There's like this duality to structure and waves that's really important. And what psychedelics do is that they alter the structure of the neurons. Continue the guitar analogy, even though it's not that great. It's like playing a different chord on the guitar. Dispense with that analogy quickly, though, because we're going to go into the details of what they actually do to neurons. Just backstepping a bit, you'll see this graph here. If you've done psychedelic research before, you've probably seen it. What this is a map of brain communication, and it doesn't look anything like a map because it's had a bunch of math done to it. But essentially, each of the little dots are brain regions, and each of the lines between the dot is the amount of communication that's happening between the brain regions. And on the left, you have the brain in a sober state, and on the right, you have the brain in a psychedelic state. So what psychedelics are doing is they are greatly increasing the extent to which different parts of your brain communicate with each other. They're connecting things that aren't usually connected. And how are they doing that? Neuroplasticity, and specifically dendritic arborization. What is dendritic arborization? Well, if you remember the neuron, there's the main body, there's a long sending cable, then there's all this like fluffy stuff, the dendrites, the receiving areas. And psychedelics make that fluffy stuff grow. So if you look at these graphs, all of these strands are like a single strand, I guess, from a neuronal dendrite that have been exposed to different drugs. The vehicle means nothing. That's a control in neuroscience. It's just water. And then each of these different drugs are different psychedelics. DOI, DMT, and LSD are all psychedelic drugs. And you'll see, if you look at the neuron, on the drugs, you have way more going on. You have these little branches growing off, and they're increasing their connectedness. Literally, neuron by neuron, there's just a little more going on. There's more they can connect to. There's more neurons upstream that are sending them signals. And that's why you get this large interconnectedness of the brain. Just to like maybe make that a little more visual, here is like some graphical representations of the neurons. This is a statistical map of like how many crossings they have, i.e. how many other neurons they're connecting to, and how far away they are from the center. So you'll see in general that they make more connections more distantly. They also create more sensitive synapses acutely, which is interesting. It's probably why they're like active on short term. And this leads to like a hypersynesthesia of sensory information because you have all these different parts of the brain that are communicating with each other so much more than they normally would. And this can give us some pretty interesting accounts of like psychedelic experience. Because you'll often have people saying, oh, I was like seeing color and tasting sound and hearing space and feeling the texture of emotion against my skin. Well, a lot of this can come down to this. It's the neurons that are getting more connected that are leading to more functional connectivity in the brain. Okay. So, just a little bit more neuroscience. Something that's really interesting about 5-HT2A receptors, the target that is specific to psychedelics, is that all of them are found in the cortex. And this probably is another thing that won't get super mentioned in like basic neuroscience courses, but the cortex is like kind of the center in your brain that makes reality around you. It's like where all the sensory processing goes on. Which is to say it's like the area of the brain that brings in all the signals from all your sensory organs and then like turns them into a cohesive something instead of just like random noise. Um, it's your world builder, and the psychedelics hit the world builder, which begins to make sense because psychedelics, yeah, if you're having a drug that targets a receptor system that's exclusively in the cortex, and the cortex is primarily responsible for sensory perception, it's going to affect your sensory perception. Um, it also directs your attention, but that is a little more complicated. The way to kind of think of that is your attention is like what brings things into your sensory reality. Um, okay, subjective effects. Something that's super common is stimulation anxiety during the psychedelic onset. It's like this up curve of experience here. Here is a quote from Aldous, no, here's a quote from Albert Hoffman's My Problem Child, LSD, that's talking about kind of what this feels like. That brings us relatively neatly to some like acute phenomenology of psychedelics. The images you see in front of you are artistic recreations of a psychedelic trip, and they are pretty accurate. You'll notice that symmetry plays a pretty big factor. There's like this general shiftiness to a lot of things, and maybe like some enhanced vibrance, some enhanced depth perception, that sort of thing. Of course, they can get more intense than this as well. Here's another wonderful depiction by a friend of mine. This is roughly what it would look like. Of course, it's kind of weird and like Steam gamey, but this is roughly what it would look like to actually have a high dose experience on DMT, for example, or potentially something like psilocybin. Um, you'll notice, or at least hopefully you've noticed, that like fractal patterns and symmetry are really, really key to psychedelic experience. Um, and this is really non-trivial. Um, hyperbolic geometry is also something else that shows up repeatedly, which is like this experience of curved space. Um, in 3D, the fractal nature leads to this curved space. It's known as hyperbolic geometry. And if you ever hear someone say something like, well, I took DMT and then I fell into a black hole and it was insane, that's like the phrase falling into a black hole. That's a non-trivial description of the geometry that's going on. Because the way that like space curves around a black hole can be done geometrically with experiences in your brain. Um, and better mathematical ability is linked to um, obviously a better ability to characterize the kind of fractals and patterns that show up in psychedelic experiences, but also an increased ability to control and analyze geometry. So I said earlier that this hyperbolic geometry is non-trivial. Why? It's a product of information density in the brain. And I really hope I don't lose you here, but I might, so I'm gonna take a quick second. Okay, I'm gonna try to explain what's going on in this slide, but it might be difficult. Imagine each neuron is the corner of of four squares. So if you look on this diagram over to the left, you've got this grid of squares. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that each of the corners of those squares is a single neuron, and each of the four lines that make the squares is a dendrite. If you look at the shape over on the right side of the screen, you'll see that each of these shapes are squares. They each have four sides. But if you look at the corner, it doesn't have four sides. You've got five squares meeting at a point. You've got too many things going on. This is essentially like the underlying feature of hyperbolic geometry. And going back to the thinking of the corners as neurons, well, if psychedelics make neurons more interconnected, how do you fit how do you fit more than four dendrites in each neuron? You have to curve space to do it. And this is where fractal geometry and more explicitly experience of curved spaces come. Because if you have a corner of squares and you make five things come out of it, you're going to have to deal with some things there. So, getting a little out of the cognitive neuroscience and like theory of perception and all that, and into like kind of what happens in a narrative sense during a trip. Something that is very common is like this profound salience of everything, associative thinking and all. So, to quote Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, about his mescaline experience, those folds in the trousers, what a labyrinth of endlessly significant complexity. And the textures of the gray flannel, how rich, how deeply, mysteriously sumptuous. He's talking about a pair of trousers, but he's on mescaline, so it's the most important thing in the world. I am essentially going to skip this one. In a very short sense, a lot of like philosophies are different ways of understanding the relationship between like the self and the world and how that's structured. And you can like experience a wide variety of these structures on psychedelics. Um, okay. Um, Let us dive into some of the psychology and medicinal aspects of psychedelics. Like, how can things be used to heal? Um, to get one thing out of the way, I want to dispense with the idea of ego death. To quote a researcher in this field, ego death is a slang term because it means like so many things. Um, the concept of ego comes from like a variety of different places. In our Western culture, it's mostly like wrapped up in like Freudian and Jungian ideas of like wanting to do something but stopping yourself from doing it. And that's kind of associated with like an internal monologue process. And obviously, when you take drugs, there's so many ways for the structure to break down. But like, there's so many ways for it to break down. So you could like become one with everything, and that's one way for your like sense of internal narrative to go away. Or you could become completely separated from everything, and that could be another way for your sense of internal narrative or your ego to die. Like, it's just not a specific term. There are so many ways that sense can dissolve, that sense of self can dissolve, that I really don't like it. Um, Another common myth is that of the default mode network. Um, what is a default mode network? It's a bunch of things in the brain that do a thing when you're not doing anything. Um, if you want to think about it, it's stuff like daydreaming, self-talk, being in your own head, automatic mental habits, rumination, that sort of thing. And why is, well, first of all, why is like psychedelics associated with the default mode network? Well, some researchers in Imperial College London published a paper in like 2017 to relatively failing critical acclaim. Why is this default mode network theory myth? Well, if you think about the things that the mode network is, like daydreaming, being distracted, ruminating, it's easy to get out of this mode, but not start tripping. You can close the default mode network by like smoking a cigarette or doing 3 push-ups or flicking yourself in the forehead twice. Um, there's clearly much more in a psychedelic experience than simply shutting down the default mode network. It's like saying, oh, well, actually, I don't know. I don't know how to analogize it. Um, what is like the real deal of psychedelic psychology? It's entropic processing. It's this idea of things becoming more interconnected and that interconnection of things leading to new ways to process information and new insights. A way of thinking about this in psychological terms is like anti-suppressants and hyper-learning agents. Um, the hold on. So when you take a psychedelic, right, you've got the cortex, and the cortex makes a world around you, and it makes your thoughts in a very general way. And you take a psychedelic, it all gets interlinked. but doesn't hit the limbic system. The limbic system is the center of your brain. It's the center that does emotional processing. Essentially, what you could be seen as doing is making the cortex hyper efficient at processing because it's so much more connected and can do so many more things, and you're making it more sensitive to your emotional states. And this is why it's like a psychological catalyst. Because you're in this state that is so sensitive and doing so much more processing, the things that happen in it will be pretty impactful. Moreover, a really unique and weird thing about psychedelics is that like these changes last for a very long time. No one's sure why. It's not just that you become really sensitive, it's that when you learn something in that sensitive state, it settles in, it embeds itself, and it grows over the like months and years after a psychedelic trip. And this can be like really good or really bad. It depends what your mind state is going into the trip. It depends on like what actually happens during the trip, and it depends very heavily on what you do after the trip and how you like integrate the things you learned and build it into the rest of your life. Um, it will leave a strong mark in your psyche, so don't just like go out and like do it for fun on a weekend without thinking about it when you have things to do the next day. Um, there's this hero's journey heuristic that's really popular amongst psychologists in Western culture. It's kind of flawed, but it also kind of works for what you need it to do. Um, Essentially, you're like in this world of the known, you enter this crazy world of the unknown where things are frightening but formative, and you take lessons from that and you bring it back into your life, and you hopefully become a better person for that. It's kind of a good way of approaching psychedelic therapy. Um, And this is where the importance of like mindset and setting come in, especially more so in like the neuroplasticity sense and the things becoming embedded and being able to process more and learning new things about yourself. These psychedelics aren't doing anything inherently positive to you. At least that's my theory. I don't think that it's like a one-stop shop to cure depression that you just have to take and it'll be good. They're antidepressants that make you more sensitive to yourself and your environment. So if you're in a really bad place and you're not going into it with positive attitude and you're scared of everything, that's just gonna become louder. You're just gonna become more sensitive to that. Um, it's important to prepare and go into it with calmness and positivity and optimism and curiosity and warmth. Um, and it's also important to not try and like suppress anything because you're so sensitive that if you're going into it, you can't keep those things down anymore. You can't ignore them. There's too much going on here. There's too much connectedness for them to be disconnected and ignored. Um, if there are incongruities, tensions, lies in yourself, or you and your environment around you, or the people you're around when you're taking psychedelics, they will likely surface. Um, Here's an example of bad ingredients. It's another story, essentially where these people are having an affair and they take LSD thinking it's going to be a really fun time, but it reveals like all the innate horrors of the situation and all the tension between them and all the tension there in their own lives, and it's just a very bad night. Interestingly enough, about this story, it ended up being therapeutic, and the moral for the adulterer was to appreciate his family more. Um, okay, yeah, stability and optimism. Even good trips are very destabilizing. You're hypersensitive, etc. It's important to have a source of stability, safety, and optimism when tripping and after. Um, and this is like open-eyed optimism. This isn't ignoring the bad things. This isn't punishing yourself failing to deal with the bad things. It's confronting problems with self-gentleness, patientness, humility, and optimism, and accepting that change is a gradual process and to be attentive to things that are going well. Because again, attention is kind of like what brings things into your reality. The more you pay attention to positive things, the better your reality will be as a gradual process. Um, Also, the importance of surrender. Life is an uncontrollable experience, and the psychedelic trip is the epitome of an uncontrollable experience. This is a common motif, surrender, in various religions. In Islam, it's a literal translation. Buddhism is an obsession with surrender and attachment to the world, and Christianity is a surrender to God or a higher power. And then finally, I would like to put in some words on self-preservation and optimism. Um, don't make us sell drugs. It's the worst time to do it. If you want to make us sell drugs, wait like 5 or 10 years, get your degree in chemistry or botany. You can go work and do skills legally that can pay you that you can repurpose into drug production once that becomes safe and legal. Don't do it now. Don't be like, oh, I'm gonna be cool and I'm gonna be a drug dealer and I'm gonna spend my life being paranoid about cops being around the corner just because I think it's cool or whatever. You're gonna make life more stressful for yourself if everything goes well, and if everything doesn't go well, you're gonna end up in a living hell and or selling your friends to the police. Just a few shout outs, Josie Kins and the Effect Index community. Most of the art you've seen in these slides was AI generated. I learned a lot of the skills to do that from hanging around her and her people on the internet. Super cool community, super cool research. Highly recommend digging deeper if you want to know more about like how do you communicate about like psychedelic visual experiences. And then huge shout out to Qualia Research Institute. This is an independent research organization that was founded by a few Stanford graduates. Um, they do more in-depth psychophysics than any mainstream academia is doing. They are acknowledged by very, very, very key players in mainstream neuroscience and biology, though. Um, and most of the ideas that I gave like a tidbit of in terms of the importance of symmetry and this theme of the importance of geometry and wave processing. They go into far more rigorous depth. So if you're interested in math or meditation or physics and neuroscience or philosophy, I highly, highly recommend checking them out. Okay. Um, so just SSDP wise, a few announcements if this makes it to you in time. Um, On Tuesday, March 21st, we're hosting our Soma and Stimulation GBM. Soma is a really interesting substance. It was a drug that was worshipped by a lot of ancient Hindus and a lot of ancient Zoroastrians, which is kind of like a precursor religion to Christianity. Um, we're going to be going over like the archaeology, trying to figure out what drug it is, talking about the pharmacology, how that drug works in the brain and body, and then like other ways that that drug has since shown up in different cultures around the world. Um, on April 1st, we are hosting a rave. We are going to be having some fun at Signal. The times are 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. The cover fee is $10 a person and it's 18 plus. Drinks are available for people 21 and over. Again, that is on April 1st. And then our final meeting of the semester is going to be psilocybin for eating disorders. This is actually research that is currently going on at UF. There is clinical psilocybin research happening on campus, which is pretty cool. The principal investigator for that research is Jesse Dallery, and he's going to be giving us a speech about who he is and what his lab does and what it's like running a clinical trial. That is going to be on Tuesday, April 11th. So if you're interested in joining any of those, if you're interested in meeting me, if you're interested in becoming a member of SSDP, highly recommend you show up to one of these. We also have a GroupMe and a website. If you want sources for most of what I've said in this, if you want additional readings, if you want to see kind of what like our mission statements are or like look at some art, please visit our website. If you want to join the GroupMe, You can do that right here at that QR code. So once again, I'm Thomas Child. I'm the incoming president for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Reach out to me at tchild, TCHILD at UFL .edu. Man, it's late at night. If you want to ask me any questions about this presentation, if there wasn't anything that's clear enough, or if you're super passionate about drugs and you want to get involved in helping lead this club. We are currently looking for leaders, and if you are interested, highly recommend showing up to one of our GBMs and chatting to me on our website. There is also going to be a series of steps you can do to apply for leadership, which basically just involves answering some basic questions and scheduling an interview. After that, it's a month where you do something, whether it's like running a social media site or doing like investigative research or hosting like lunches for the club. It just depends on like what you want to do. There's a bunch of opportunities in that direction. Please feel free to reach out. And thanks so much. This video is probably going to plant health and spirituality, which is Tierney's class, and then you might see it elsewhere. Thank you.